I had some technical difficulties in my last conversation, so I'm just gonna give it a minute and make sure everything's working right.
Okay.
All right, let's see if I can hear everything.
All right. You need a sound test?
Yeah, sound test.
All right. Valnat april
All
with the
right, let's
shura
see
sota, the
if
drota
I can
varchat
hear
persa
everything.
to the rota, and bothered every vein and sweet the core, which there's two
Yeah, sound
engendered is
test.
the floor. All right. One Zephyrus ache with the sweta breath and spirit half and every hope
All
and
right,
drota
seems like it's
varchat
working.
persa to the rota. All right. Middle English, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales for you. All right. One Zephyrus ache with the sweta breath and spirit half and every hope and
Latin,
drota
right?
varchat persa to the rota. Middle English, but it does sound Latinish. A few words that sound very Germanic. But
All right, looks like we're good. So just to jump right in, Paul, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
sure. I am the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University, West Palm Beach, Florida. I have written, edited, co-authored, that sort of thing, about 35 books, and contributed to the same amount of other, in other books. And I have a PhD in philosophy from Marquette University, and live in West Palm Beach, Florida. I'm happily married and have 6 kids. And I do a lot of traveling and speaking, and but based here in West Palm Beach, Florida.
Lucky you.
Yeah, especially for those Minnesotans in the dead of winter.
Yeah, all that white stuff. Ugh. So just to jump right in, I'm an atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there is any reason to believe in the existence of God. Could you tell me some of the reasons you believe there are for believing in God? Then I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Sure. We can jump in. Maybe I could, and maybe you'll get to this too. I know that when there are some agnostics also who will say there isn't enough evidence for God's existence. So it'd be good to have clarification on how you differ from the agnostic, who might also say there isn't enough evidence for belief in God. So anyway, but that's something we can get to down the road.
Oh, let me jump to answer that right away. So
Oh, yeah, sure.
my claim is a little bit stronger. I'm saying there is no evidence. That's a positive claim. So I'm saying I'm an atheist towards the fact that there is evidence. There's absolutely no evidence to indicate the existence of a God. So rather than an agnostic who could per se say there may be some evidence but it's not compelling, I'm making the positive claim there is absolutely none.
Yeah. Well, you could say, it's logically possible, of course, that there isn't evidence, but that God still exists. So those are two separate distinctions. One the ontological, one the epistemological. So so that would still be, I think, need to be hashed out. Not just reason, I don't have any evidence, but there are reasons for rejecting the existence of God. That would be the more typical atheistic argument or claim. Anyway, I would maintain that for a number of reasons. I think saying absolutely no evidence is a little too strong. I think that those who have claimed, the various philosophers and theologians, in history have maintained that there are certain reasons. You may not like them. They may not be as strong. They may not live up to your bar of, the bar of scrutiny or level of acceptability. But it's not as though there isn't anything out there. But I would say that for a wide range of reasons, that God makes more sense than that belief in God is more plausible than the denial that God exists. So and I think that if you compare, I'd say probably take on some sort of a version of naturalism. It could be a broad naturalism, which I think borrows from theism, or it could be a strict, more, I know that people like you may not like the word reductionistic, but some naturalists are very happy with that, and they'll say, yeah, so what of it? But there is the strict or puritanical naturalism that doesn't allow for any sort of objective moral values. That there's no room for even consciousness, something like Daniel Dennett. There's no room for personal responsibility. We're just dancing to the music of our DNA, as Richard Dawkins says. So it is a stark worldview if you take the strict naturalistic approach. And I think that's the more consistent one. But I'd say that it doesn't account for the range of experience, both as human beings as well as in the world around us. So I think, for example, the universe, that something exists is an amazing thing. As many have remarked, the fact that something, Ludwig Wittgenstein, was amazed that something existed. Why does anything exist at all? I think that's an important question to be asked. Something that actually turned, how do you get anything that exists? Something that Paul Williams, a former Buddhist, said that after 23 years of Buddhism, thought that the fact that something exists makes better sense if there's a God on which everything rests, that there is some sort of a basis for all contingent existence. And that also can bring you to the cosmological argument where if everything in the universe is finite, contingent, if the universe began to exist a finite time ago, makes sense that there is something, whether it's the maximally great being, God, or something else, it's unless you believe that something can pop into existence uncaused out of nothing, it seems that we have good reason for saying that there's something remarkable, immense, powerful to bring a universe into being. And so, even if you take the multiverses view, those universes began to exist. There's a beginning to them as well. So the universe is not eternal. There's a growing consensus on that, and I think fairly well established. So I think when it comes to the beginning of the universe, we have, I think, strong reasons for saying that it's at least ontologically haunted. There is something there. And could this be the God whom I worship? I think we're moving in the right direction. I think the fine-tuning of the universe, if there is an intelligent being that who desires to relate to human beings, well, then the structure of the universe, the fact that the universe not only exists, of course, you need for human beings to exist, you need a universe to exist, and you need a life-permitting universe, which is quite a significant set of criteria that are and parameters are required. And then you need not only a life-permitting universe, it's possible you have a life-permitting universe, but nothing happens. You need a life-producing universe, which is how do you get from life, to non-living matter, to life, which again has a whole new set of parameters that are required. And then how do you get from a bacterium to Bach, as Daniel Dennett put it? That requires another set of torturous steps. Well, if there's a God who exists, then ordering all of these things, bringing all of these things to completion, so that there could be human beings to relate to God. It's a highly probable, if God exists. But again, if you're a betting man, I wouldn't go with a naturalistic viewpoint on this. So again, there's some of those reasons. We also talk about matters such as consciousness, the fact that awareness, even self-awareness exists. It seems that this source of consciousness being non-conscious matter is less likely, less secure a position than, say, a conscious being that, or we could say the same thing if you hold to moral values. I think they exist. I think it's pretty clear that objective moral values, that these are rooted in something valuable rather than the product of valueless processes. So, we can talk about beauty. We can talk about, is beauty simply the product of mindless materialistic forces? Well, I think, scientists themselves take beauty as a criteria, or elegance as a criterion for judging mathematical or scientific theorems. Very interesting. There's a presumption, a kind of a philosophical or even theological presumption that exists here. I would say also that there are, we can talk about moral responsibility. We take moral responsibility as a given as human beings. We don't say in a court of law, "Your Honor, my genes made me do it." We can be held responsible for our actions, and rightly so. So how do we get from, say, personal responsibility, the ability to rise above our genes and environment? How do we get that from, say, prior deterministic causes producing beliefs in us over which we have no control? It seems that something, within a theistic framework makes better sense of that than a deterministic or a naturalistic one. And on it goes. I mean, I could talk about other things. We talk about the evidences and scientific supports and even historical arguments. If you want to talk about the resurrection of Jesus, I think there are good reasons for that. I mean, if you're highly probable, more plausible than their denials. But I don't think that is a I would say to say absolutely no evidence just seems to be too extreme a statement. With all due respect.
All right, let me defend that position.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm not done. I'm on a roll, but feel free to jump in.
All right, so you brought up quite a number of arguments. My position is essentially that if all of that can be explained equally or better by a non-god, then it would not be evidence of a god. For example, like if you have a box and you claim there is a rabbit in the box, and you say the reason there's a rabbit in the box is because the box weighs 2 pounds. The fact the box weighs 2 pounds isn't evidence of a rabbit because it could be explained by a non-rabbit, like a lizard or a coffee mug, or
Sure.
et cetera, et cetera. So if any of the arguments you have can be explained equally well by a non-god alternative as well as a god, then that evidence would not in fact be evidence of a god. And so if I can explain everything you've presented cumulatively equally by a non-god as well as you do by a god, then none of that would actually be evidence of a god. And that's the approach I'm going to take. Instead of arguing for theism, I'm going to say that all of that can be explained by essentially a naturalistic pantheism, a kind of naturalism as you proposed. For example, you brought up morality and consciousness and beauty and justice. All of those could be explained by undiscovered natural processes that we just don't know about yet. I mean, I grant that none of the current natural processes give us a way to ground those things, but that doesn't mean there can't be any. Just like they could be explained by some supernatural being, they could equally be explained by an unknown natural cause that we just don't know about yet. I see no reason to jump to a completely new ontological category that, as far as I know, we have no evidence for, as opposed to just adding in a new property to the things we already know about. So from my experience, when we look around in the world, all the things we couldn't explain, like lightning and fairy circles and the movement of the sun, which were attributed to beings, godlike beings, were eventually discovered to be just unknown natural processes that we didn't understand at the time. Even space-time bending is one really great example I like to use. We thought it was completely logically impossible for space-time to bend. That was one of the arguments that was used against Einstein's general relativity, but the science was right, and our intuitions and our what we consider to be a logical contradiction is just wrong. What we consider to be logical problems isn't a problem for nature. Nature doesn't care about our philosophical misgivings about certain kinds of quandaries. So it seems to me equally plausible that we can ground objective morality in an undiscovered natural process as opposed to a supernatural process. And we seem to have a lot more support for the natural processes than we do this new category.
Okay, gotcha. Well, thanks for clarifying. I would say, one, if you are claiming that what if natural processes, even if we don't know them now, what if natural processes could explain these things? Well, I think that's part of the issue, again, my pressing you on the agnosticism versus atheism claim. I think you're more securely positioned in an agnostic camp because you could say, well, it's logically possible that, equally possible, that there could be some sort of a revelation, some sort of indication, some sort of an emerging evidence that will secure the existence of God and convince someone like yourself. So I think you're leaving it open on both fronts, aren't you?
Right, so I'm adopting the definition of atheism used by most popular atheists like Hitchens, Harris, and Dawkins. So that may not be the one used philosophically, and I grant that. I just identify it more with that definition. So I'm more of the epistemic kind where I'm talking about, I'm not saying there is absolutely no God, I'm just saying there's no evidence of a God, and that's the position I'm
Okay.
defending.
Yeah, but you would be unlike an ornery agnostic who says I don't know and you can't know either. You're maybe the ordinary agnostic who says, yeah, if there is evidence, I'd like to know about it, and if if there's evidence, I would believe in God. So I assume that you're the latter.
Sure, but I identify again with the term atheism like most common day atheists around the world right now.
Yeah, of course, from a definitional point of view, I suppose the standard textbooks would be against you, but and it sounds like the stronger position when it actually isn't. So, anyway, it strikes me as fudging a little bit, but so I'd say, well, why not call yourself an agnostic? It seems like
Well,
it's the more
definitions change to meet how the language is used, and right now the majority of atheists I agree with the Sam Harris kind of definition of atheism that we reject that you have any reasons. Like, it's not really important to us whether or not God exists. The point is that there's no reason to believe in one, just like there's no reason to believe in Santa. That is essentially the global majority atheist position right now, regardless of whether or not philosophers like the definition. Like the word gay
yeah.
didn't used to mean or wasn't associated with the LGBT community, but they adopted it. The atheist community has kind of done the same thing, but that's not really an interesting point of the debate. It's just this is the definition we're using, and if you disagree with it, you would be strawmanning our position. Just like if we said faith is a position without any evidence, we may be strawmanning your position.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can appreciate how language changes, but even in the contemporary lexica, you do have atheism most frequently, defined as the rejection of belief in God. But it sounds like you're more the ornery agnostic in this case, that you reject that there's even evidence for the existence of God. So anyway, but I don't want to get bogged down in definitions. Our viewers can decide and make up their own minds. I would say a couple things. So pantheism, everything is naturalistic pantheism. Could you elaborate a little bit on pantheism? Everything is divine. Everything is God. Um, you know, perhaps hash that out a little bit, but also, secondly, everything has not always existed. The universe came to existence a finite time ago. We were talking about contingent existence here, not eternal existence. So all the things that you're talking about that are divine began to exist. Anyway, feel free to just comment on that, and I'll say a few more things beyond.
All
Go
right.
ahead.
So my definition of naturalistic pantheism comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the pantheism
Mm-hmm.
section, and it defines naturalistic pantheism as a view that doesn't endorse anything that isn't ontologically endorsed by science, essentially. So the way I like to phrase it is, it's essentially eternal, all-powerful nature. So that would essentially be my definition of pantheism. It's eternal, all-powerful nature, no consciousness. So it's different from a god in the sense that it has no brain or no consciousness in that sense. And then
So you are not conscious then too, right?
no, I
So
mean the entity of
okay,
pantheism itself is not conscious.
okay, but consciousness emerged from this non-conscious nature. You're saying,
Yes.
okay, all right.
And to your second question, the cosmological argument, I agree there has to be a necessary thing. I'm in agreement with you there, but that necessary thing doesn't need to be a conscious being. It could be a deistic being, or a polytheism, or transtheism, or naturalistic pantheism. And so I'm adopting naturalistic pantheism as the necessary thing from whence the universe came, and then also what consciousness came.
Okay, so if nature is finite, I'm not sure how, it's obviously not all powerful because it needs something to jumpstart it and get it going. So it is not all powerful. It's contingent. So if it's dependent upon something outside of itself or independent of itself, then it's not all powerful nature.
Right, but only our universe came into existence, not all nature. So I would reject the idea that there can be nothing outside of our universe, which nothing in physics even endorses that position. The consensus in physics is that our space and our time came into existence at the Big Bang, which means the thing represented by the equations in general and special relativity. But that doesn't mean there's nothing outside of that. It never even applies such a thing. There are
Yeah, and what is your evidence for that?
there are many theories in physics that can show things outside of space and time. For example, Nima Arkani Hamad's amplituhedron, he wrote a paper about it, where there is space and time is emergent from some more fundamental natural thing. There's also Sean Carroll's theory of emergent space-time, which approaches the same topic in a different way. There are theories of multiple kinds of time. For example, Itzel-Barr's two-time physics, Stephen Hawking's imaginary time, Julian Barber's end of time. There are lots of grounds in physics for things outside of our universe. There's not really nothing in physics indicates that it's absolutely everything. It's not even a thing in physics.
So the laws that apply to our universe would apply to laws, beyond the universe, right? That you would say that there's a consistency throughout, rather than it applying to just our universe, and who knows what's going on with these other universes or a realm beyond our own.
Not like laws of logic, I would assume, do, but the laws of physics do not. Laws of physics specifically apply to our universe and our space-time. They may or may not apply outside of that.
Okay, so like the second law of thermodynamics wouldn't necessarily apply across the board.
Well, the second law of thermodynamics only applies to closed systems. So if any open system, it doesn't apply to that at all.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it seems like you're leaving. I think there certainly is room for God. I mean, there are certainly hypotheses. Even Stephen Hawking say imaginary time. Again, he's positing. Again, imaginary, not real time. And
Well, apologize just to interrupt. Imaginary time is a reference to imaginary numbers. It's a type of
right,
mathematical
exactly.
vector. It's not actually imaginary in the sense that it's in your head.
Well, I know, but he's not a realist when it comes to these things, as you know. He's an instrumentalist when it comes to those things. So just so long as something works in the universe, it doesn't matter if it corresponds to reality. He says, I don't even know what that is. So again, I would say that there is something that I just find problems with appealing to somebody like a Stephen Hawking. But be that as it may, the fact that things like consciousness, beauty, self-determination, and the like, what I went through the list, the fact that these things exist, that they somehow emerged out of, again, non-conscious matter. It seems that it seems like something conscious, free, powerful, and so forth, some sort of an agent to bring the universe about from a state of, say, from an unchanged state to bring about change. It seems like a personal agent would make excellent sense of that, whereas that this simply, popped into existence uncaused without any sort of matter. I mean, physicists themselves, we can talk about Joseph Silk, who, not a theist, but says that the universe that we know about looks pretty much like the traditional doctrine of creation out of nothing. And when people ask us what preceded it, we tell them the answer is simple: nothing. And I'd say, well, a personal being to produce change from this changeless state makes a lot more sense of it than that. In fact, Paul Davies, the respected physicist, recognizes that you basically have two options. Either the universe popped into existence uncaused out of nothing, or that there is some sort of a cause outside or independent of the universe that brought it into being. In fact, excuse me, is these sorts of evidences that persuaded Antony Flew, who said he wanted to follow the evidence wherever it leads. So he saw something remarkable about the fine tuning of the universe, about the beginning of the universe, about the structures of biological life. Anthony Kenny, who's an agnostic, maintains that if the person is truly an atheist, he's going to have to admit that the universe came to existence by nothing, from nothing, and that's one of the reasons he's an agnostic, because he has reasons for rejecting God on the one hand, but there are reasons for that the theist has going for him, that the universe began to exist a finite time ago, and that this is where things point, that you can appeal to maybe other universes and so forth. But in terms of evidence, I mean, I'd say you're basically in the same position that you charge the theist of being in. There's no. I mean, I can give you. We can talk about evidences from consciousness, evidences from freedom, and so forth. And in fact, I would even appeal to certain things, such as, I mean, if there are objective moral values. I don't know if you hold to objective moral values.
I do.
Okay. I mean, how do we even deal with things like the moral gap, as John Hare talks about them, the gap between our own performance and our own, and the ideal that we know that exists. One former atheist, Francis Spufford, said that he found that his own atheism couldn't supply that way of dealing with guilt. He said he needed mercy. He needed something to deal with a guilty conscience, and he said he found it in not in a naturalistic frame of reference, but in a theistic one, and specifically a Christian one. And I think that there are those kinds of existential questions too that are also important to consider. I mean, how do you deal with guilt, Tom? How do you deal with resolving those shortcomings? In a sense, the need for forgiveness, even if nobody else knows what you've done, but yet feeling that heaviness within, recognizing that you've fallen short. That there is there may be something to those rituals about purification and cleansing that human beings have experienced over the millennia. That there is a desire to be free from those heavy weights of guilt and shame and so forth. Those are real questions. Those are real issues, not ones to be passed off lightly. And also I would say that when it comes to certain things like our own significance, our own finding security, our longing, at least most of us, longing for immortality, dealing with the fear of death and so forth. What if there's a God who exists and has made a provision for these sorts of things to help us to deal with those sorts of issues? I think there are some very practical, reasonable existential considerations here that also can figure in. We are, after all, holistic beings. We seek meaning, we seek purpose, and we find our lives making sense around these meaning. This idea of living for a purpose and so forth. So I think that there are existential reasons in addition to evidential ones. And anyway.
Let me pick up on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, even though you're right that Stephen Hawking is not a realist about imaginary time, Nima Arkani Haman, Sean Carroll, and the other people I listed are. So there are physicists who are realists about things existing outside or prior to space-time. Secondly, I agree that many of the atheists who you cited do not believe that there can be a basis of objective morality, but I don't think they're very creative. I think just like we can create a grounds for objective morality in the supernatural, we can do the same with the unknown natural. We can come up with possible bases like an undiscovered law of nature that affects our brain in some way, just to come up with something off the top of my head.
Okay.
And so there's no reason to think that the unknown natural can't do that unless you're simply assuming that, well, all the stuff we currently know about naturalism can't do it. Therefore, no natural ever can do it, which would be like a composition division fallacy. And I think that's the same kind of thing you're making in the case of consciousness and morality and free will, where you say, How could consciousness come from non-conscious? Well, I mean, we get walls from non-walls and oceans from non-oceans and stars from non-stars. So it seems that there's not really a hard contradiction there, only in the sense that we can't explain it yet. Like, how did lightning come from non-lightning? They couldn't explain that 2,000 years ago, but it's technically possible. They just didn't know the physics behind it at the time. And so I would apply the same thing to consciousness and morality and all the different things that we look at. They could all just be undiscovered natural processes, because when we look back through history, everything we didn't know about was always discovered to be an undiscovered natural thing that we just didn't know about. So why would that be different in the case of consciousness or morality or justice or meaning and purpose or even an afterlife? There could definitely be an afterlife in a theistic or an atheistic worldview. For example, if we lived in the Matrix, if we die here and wake up in the Matrix, we could have an afterlife, and we just don't know about it yet. So all of those things can be explained under the atheistic worldview, but as a naturalist, I tend to only believe things that are combinations of verifiable principles, particles, and laws in physics. So I don't believe those things, but they could exist just like a God could exist. So I wouldn't say that the theistic worldview is a better explanation. It's just one that goes beyond the evidence, and the scientists and the atheists could do the same, they just choose not to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we can double down on a few of those things, but just, you just mentioned, why do you trust the workings of the deliverances of your mind, that they're leading you to warranted true belief rather than, say, merely accidental true belief? Why do you trust that these processes that are all prior to your own present thoughts, over which you have no control, why would you think that there is actually why should you trust in the workings of your mind? Why should we trust anything that our minds are producing if they're based on forces, physical forces over which we have absolutely no control?
Well, I would see no reason not to believe them. I mean, for example, you're bringing up essentially Plantinga's argument against evolutionary naturalism, correct?
Yeah, or Balfour's or Lewis's or whatever. I mean, it's been
Right.
around.
So, from my perspective, it is equally likely that our senses correspond to reality under naturalism as it is that they correspond to reality under theism. There is equally as many possibilities that they could be true or false under naturalism as there is under theism. Like, for example, there could be a God that makes us not want to believe or not want to uh, understand reality accurately, like Descartes' evil demon argument. But it could be the case that under naturalism, that it does give us an accurate representation of reality just by pure happenstance. And so I don't see any difference in the two positions there. It's like they could be or they could not be, but I tend to take the fallibilistic position of most philosophers and say that they do seem to uh, believe or do seem to correspond to reality and give us a justified true belief.
Yeah, well, it sounds as though you're, you know, obviously trusting in the workings of your mind, which I mean makes excellent sense if there is a God who has made us in His image, a God of truth, not an evil demon, but a God of truth, who gives to us not only you know, common sense and the ability to follow natural laws to their logical conclusions and so forth, logical laws, follow them to their logical conclusions. It seems to me that that is something that is better anchored in a world that springs from a an intelligent mind, rather than the product of blind material forces that somehow produce reliable mental life and logical thinking. Just seems to be a disconnect, again, all the way across the board.
Well, let me pick up on that.
Pardon?
Let me pick up on that and respond to that.
Yeah, okay, good.
So, from my perspective, it seems more likely that it's a natural thing because there are many kinds of irrational things in our mind. We don't perceive reality accurately. We see illusions and delusions and misconceptions all the time. We do get some things
How do
right.
we know? How do we know they're illusions?
Well, I would take the scientific approach, and we can show that there is some difference between our imagination and our experience. When I imagine a unicorn in front of me, I don't see one. There, we can demonstrate there's a difference between those two things, and
Right,
so
exactly.
we call the
We
illusion.
differentiate between them. We're not living under some sort of a delusion. Exactly. Yeah, we can figure that out.
Right. So we can show that there are many things that we do accurately represent reality, and there are many things that don't accurately represent reality in our brains. Our brains have a mix of both, and that seems to be much more explained under the naturalistic viewpoint, where we evolved under evolution with an unguided process, and it gives us some good things and some bad things, than it does to say that there is a being who directly gave us access to both the good things and the bad things randomly.
Oh yeah, I mean there certainly is ferreting out that needs to be done to embrace as many true beliefs as possible and to reject as many false beliefs as possible. My point is that a being of a mental or spiritual being makes who freely creates makes better sense of the moral responsibility, the mental life that we have, that we can actually, that there is a certain oughtness to thought, namely that there are certain logical laws that anchor and that we are able to follow them using a certain teleological way of thinking, a certain way of thought directed toward ends that lead to proper conclusions. So yeah, we need to ferret things out in this we are creatures as well, and making our way through this world, of course. But it seems that we have a better basis for talking about something like God being the basis for trusting our thoughts than merely banking on material processes somehow producing reliable thought processes that I mean you can land on accidental true beliefs. I grant you that, but to be able to know that a lot of your compadres in the naturalistic world recognize that this is something that truth takes the hindmost to how we basically operate. That survival is the fundamental, and that truth is secondary. If we hold to false beliefs that enhance survival and reproduction, then hooray! If we believe that human beings have dignity and worth, and that we have moral duties, hooray! It'll help humans survive, even though they're utterly false beliefs. So I'd say, yeah, that makes sense given naturalism, that you can have true and false beliefs that enhance survival and reproduction. Also, I would, so that's one thing. I would also add that even the appeal to science as that something has to be scientifically verifiable in order to know something. Well, again, how did you know that? You presumably weren't working with a criterion before you picked up individual bits of knowledge. That's not how we do things. We often find out this is true, that's true, that's true, that's true, and maybe we come up with a general framework based on that. But it's not as though we've used some sort of a criterion by which to judge something to be knowledge. But I think that the very appeal to the criterion of science or scientism is problematic, as you probably have heard.
Oh, right, I agree. I actually wouldn't hold to that position, because I would say that there's different kinds of knowledge. For example, you wouldn't say that a triangle has three sides is empirically verifiable, but it can still count as
Sure.
knowledge. So I would
Yeah,
say
it just
that.
sounded like you were articulating that your knowledge was science based, and so I wanted to explore that a little bit. So you have a more nuanced account of knowledge then.
Right, right. So, I mean, even A.J. Ayer, who presented the position, acknowledged that there's a difference between the analytic and synthetic knowledge, and that is definitionally, uh, he thought that it was the definition of knowledge entailed that it was verifiable, but that definition itself was just definitional and didn't apply. So it didn't apply to itself. It wasn't circular even when he presented it. But
Right.
my position is the position of fallibilism, like most philosophers. So I believe we can have knowledge if we have a belief which is justified by something and it happens to be true. Well, then it counts as knowledge. But I don't think we have any absolute infallible grounds of knowledge, and I think that all of the problems that apply to the the secular views of knowledge also apply to the theist views of knowledge. So to assume that there is a being who will give us accurate representations of reality is no different than to assume that there is some undiscovered law of nature that'll go give us an accurate view of reality. So just like you believe that a god would have some property innate in itself which would give us an accurate view of reality, I can just say the same thing about pantheism and say, well, pantheism has some property that's going to give us an innate view, an accurate view of reality. But I don't think that really solves the problem, does it?
Well, I mean, we can go back to, I think, fundamentally comparing the resources that naturalistic pantheism brings and say, oh, somehow we got morality out of valueless processes. Somehow we got consciousness out of non-conscious matter. Somehow we got moral response, or free will or personal responsibility out of deterministic processes. Somehow we got beauty out of all of these naturalistic processes. Somehow, and on the list goes. I'd say, well, something like a personal source makes a lot better sense than a pantheistic one to account for these things that we typically associate with personhood. That these are the sorts of things that make excellent sense if a personal being exists, but you're left scratching your head. Somehow these personal qualities, these personal attributes somehow popped up on the screen, whereas there had been nothing to predict this before. If you're talking about predicting that there would be moral beings, conscious beings, that there would be beauty in the world and so forth, on theism, you're a winner. If you say, well, somehow the pantheistic, naturalistic pantheism produced all of these goodies that we just take for granted, I'd say, well, that's quite a leap. I'd say that there's a greater natural thread, a greater natural coherence between the personal explanation than the impersonal explanation to which you're appealing. That just makes better sense to me. You're saying, yeah, well, somehow it could have come. Well, I'd say, yeah, you're going to have to. I think we ultimately have to anchor, this in personhood. You're rejecting personhood, but I think personhood makes a lot better sense of these things that we know and take for granted.
Well, how is that different from when personhood was used to explain lightning or fairy circles or the movement of the sun or echoes or any of the other things in the past that people attributed to gods?
Well, I'd say there are some things that are, like, that there's an explosion at the chemical factory. We don't know how it happened. God must have done it. Well, I mean, there's a way of doing science, and the earliest scientists were, there was a recognition, of trying to get to the bottom of these processes, that there are certain ways in which events take place, typically in the world that we can study and we can make sense of. And do we have theological reason or philosophical reason for saying God must have done it? And I'd say, well, no, we don't. But I think with the big items, when it comes to the beginning of the universe, when it comes to the dignity of human beings, the moral value that human beings have, the duties that human beings have, self-consciousness, beauty, and so forth. Those are the sorts of things that are part of a broader framework, rather than the kind of the nitpicky lightning or phlogiston sorts of questions. I think that there is a lot more going on when we look at the bigger picture and we say, yes, these are fundamental anchor points that are stable and not subject to kind of the ups and downs, the fluctuations of people's ignorance. I think that there are stable anchor points when it comes to consciousness, beauty, free will, and moral responsibility, moral duties, human worth, and so forth. So I'd say that there's a broader overall picture here that makes better sense on theism than on a naturalistic pantheism.
But what do you mean by stable anchoring points? Because to me, those just seem like here are questions we don't have the answers to yet, no different from lightning. Because most of what you said seems like it could have been said by the person who worshipped Zeus 2,000 years ago. Like, we have this broader framework of how lightning works, and it's created by Hephaestus in order to redeem himself for all the things he's done in order to punish the wicked or whatever. And they could add all of these things in to explain lightning as saying, well, we have nothing in the natural world that can explain lightning. It's so foreign to us. It's so significantly different. This could be an anchoring point for something beyond, just like you do for morality. I still don't see fundamentally what the difference is.
Well, I mean, I think that we can talk about certain phenomena in nature that might be of interest, and we may be left scratching our heads about. I get that. But in terms of the sorts of things that make us human, that cut to the core of who we are as human beings, again, morality and meaning and justice and purpose and free will and moral responsibility and moral duties and human dignity and so forth. Those are the sorts of things that are much more fundamental than lightning flashes. I would say those are, kind of fundamental starting points that we begin there to make sense of our own human experience, to make sense of our own humanity. And so if we say, in the name of naturalism, I know you don't take this position, but if we take the position that, that evil doesn't exist, that, like on a Zen Buddhist view, one Zen Buddhist scholar calling Hitler very silly for the implementation of gas chambers. I'd say there's something fundamentally flawed with the worldview. Or when Richard Dawkins says that the universe is at bottom neither good nor evil. There's nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I'd say, well, I can see how you get to that viewpoint given your starting points, but I think you're denying something fundamental about reality. And I would say that that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. If you get rid of, if you say, evil, I think evil does presume some sort of a normativity, that there is some sort of a departure from the way things ought to be if we're talking about evil. But on a naturalistic worldview, it's hard to make sense of that. But all the more so with some of these, like the Zen Buddhist viewpoint, which calls it silly. And rather than acknowledging it as evil. So I'd say that these sorts of things that cut to the heart of who we are, and if we get rid of these basic things that define us as human beings, that we are moral beings, that we can recognize evil and so forth, if we, that these are those are the stable things that I'm talking about. These are the sorts of things that cut to the heart of who we are, not lightning flashes. So again, that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, I agree with you there. I'm trying to approach it from a different direction. I'm saying let's grant those things exist. We grant we have good and evil and consciousness and those kinds of things. But why would we assume that those are some new fundamental ontology that we don't know about, as opposed to just being an undiscovered natural thing? I mean,
Well, it's been eternally existent. I would say it's not new. I know you're speaking from the epistemological point of view. I'm just throwing a little humor in here.
Right. So yeah, from my perspective, it seems more reasonable to say that consciousness and morality and purpose, if they exist, could be explained by an undiscovered natural thing, just like all the things in the past. So I don't see how these are fundamentally different, because you're saying they're fundamental and they're fundamental to who we are. But I don't see that as any different from the guy 2,000 years ago was saying, well, lightning is fundamental. It's got to be fundamental. It has something to do with the core of the universe. It just seems to be like, here's something we can't explain yet, therefore God.
Well, I'd say we know a lot about personhood. We recognize the things that pertain to personhood in terms of moral responsibility, moral duties, dignity, worth. We talk about rights and so forth. We talk about self-awareness. We make moral decisions. We are held accountable for our actions and so forth. Those are the sorts of things that that's the stuff of personhood, not impersonal pantheism. That this is the stuff that we recognize is connected to personhood. I mean, one of the things that I have written about is on the issue of religious pluralism, and one of the note is that a lot of Eastern viewpoints, which emphasize an impersonal starting point, certain versions of Buddhism, of Hinduism, and so forth, that there's often an appeal to the proper basicality of personal virtues, kindness, compassion, love, and so forth. And I'd say, well, that's great. We're in agreement on a lot of these ethical practices, but it seems like you can't ground that given your impersonal worldview, yet you're lauding all of these personal virtues that somehow came out of this, whether it be pantheism or Advaita Vedanta, monism in Hinduism, it just strikes me as being fundamentally at odds with the starting point, that there are two different. Francis Schaeffer talked about the upper story, the lower story. That a lot of times the theory doesn't match up with the practice. That the fundamental ideals that are noted in the broader structure of the worldview actually can't be lived out, or you have to borrow from another worldview in order to get along. So that's the sort of thing that I'm saying, that the personal dimensions that we take for granted about human existence that we've already articulated, these make better sense if they're rooted in personhood rather than in some impersonal naturalistic pantheism.
Well, it seems to me that you're assuming they can't be reduced. You're just saying that by definition they are fundamental, therefore they're better explained by a being. But to me, that would be like saying that oceans are fundamental, therefore the thing that created the universe must be made of oceans because we see oceans. Or planets are fundamental, therefore whatever created the universe must be made of planets. I mean, the fact that we see something in the universe and experience it doesn't mean that that's intrinsically what it is. For example, we can see an optical illusion. That doesn't mean it's there. Or we can see the color red. It doesn't mean it's actually red. It doesn't mean redness is an essential part of the universe. It could just be an emergent property from something more fundamental. And so I think that all of the things that we describe as personhood could be more fundamental natural things that we just haven't discovered yet. I don't see any contradiction there. And it just seems to me that you're assuming that it is by definition fundamental, therefore it must be personhood, intrinsic, or only possibly explained by personhood.
Yeah, I would say that a couple things. First is that just because secondary processes or emergent properties, let's just take those for granted. It certainly isn't at odds with a being that utilizes those processes. Indeed, anchors the emergence of those sorts of things. If there is a personal, conscious, free, intelligent, powerful being, again, the sorts of things that we ascribe to personhood, that why couldn't this being utilize emergent processes? So thus arriving at this. Now you say, well, just apply Occam's razor here. Just get rid of the middleman. Get rid of the additional entity. I'm saying that entity is fundamental to the emergence of those properties. That you have, again, the emergence is not based on something that is merely naturalistic. But it is anchored fundamentally in personhood, that we have a being who can create directly or indirectly, but we fundamentally have a grounding of personhood that can account for not only the beginning of the universe, but also can account for the existence of conscious, moral beings. I mean, and that's why I'd say a lot of naturalists themselves, people who are atheists, maybe someone like Eric Wielenberg will talk about how these moral truths or the moral facts exist. They're these eternal moral facts, but somehow through natural processes, human beings emerged so that they would be intrinsically valuable, and would have a knowledge of these eternal moral facts that have, in a sense, been anticipating them. That these are not just contingent, these are eternal, like Platonic forms. And so that's why he opts out of a naturalistic explanation and says we need to go to a non-naturalism, because this sort of a thing isn't, you can't explain these sorts of things in natural terms. There's something that moves beyond it, kind of like G.E. Moore's reference to these non-natural properties. And I would say that there are many naturalists themselves. And I'd say, so back to Wielenberg, there's this great cosmic coincidence then that takes place. This cosmic coincidence in which these moral facts exist, and then eventually, just by pure chance development, these moral, rights-bearing beings have an awareness of those eternal moral facts that have been preceding them. I'd say a lot simpler explanation is, you can say, yeah, it could have happened that way. It could be. I'd say a much simpler, more organic explanation is that there is a being responsible for that connection, that those human beings have been made in the image of that God. And therefore, we have an intrinsic connection where we don't have to depend upon some sort of a cosmic coincidence for that to take place. And so and a lot of naturalists themselves, people like J.L. Mackie, said that if objective moral values exist, there'd be a great argument for God's existence. Joel Marx, an ethicist or philosopher, had been a Kantian, who believed in these objective moral values as an atheist. But he said, I realized that the theists are right, that these objective moral values and human rights and so forth, that these sorts of things cannot exist if there is no God. And so he basically gave up his belief in these objective moral values. And so anyway, on and on it goes. I need to wrap up here soon, just so you know. Have something at 11. But again, I would say that there is, I think, excellent reason for affirming our personal origins, that these sorts of things make excellent sense, whether through direct or indirect processes. If there is a God who exists, who desires connection with human beings, that hasn't just left us alone on our own, winds up the universe and lets it go, but actually wants to connect with us, I'd say, that the development of human beings from bacteria, that this process, which, as Daniel Dennett says, we almost didn't make it. All of these, massive improbabilities are fundamentally removed. Your trust in naturalistic processes is far greater than my trust in a God. So if you're a betting person, if you have to bet on probability here, I'd say go with God, who gets us from zero to Homo sapiens, rather than all these hurdles that you've got to go through as a naturalist. I mean, that's quite an act of trust there.
All right, so just to jump in on that, I think that's a really great point, because from my perspective, assuming that there is a God who has a particular nature that would create all of these things is equally as fine-tuned or improbable as to assume that there is a nature or a naturalistic pantheism that's just determined to make all of these things. Because there are equally as many variations of how a God could be as there are variations of how naturalistic pantheism or the universe could be. So if you're going to assume that a God is personal and moral and would create beings like us, as opposed to creating a universe of nothing, then I can also just assume that there is a naturalistic pantheism that is determined to make a universe exactly like this, when it seems like those are exactly the same, probabilistically.
Well, no, I mean, if we're talking about, presumably we're not just talking about any version of God, we're talking about a maximally great being, the greatest conceivable being. So there is going to be, supreme self-awareness and moral goodness and all of these sorts of things. So it's not as though it just could be any sort of random collection of universes willy-nilly. No, I'd say that there would be some universes that would be excluded. Of course, if this being is free, then this being doesn't have to create at all. It's a free choice rather than something that flows from necessity. But I would say that you have that the sorts of things that are. I think that we're coming back to the same sort of point here, that all of these sorts of things reflect personhood. That these core of our own existence that we recognize about moral, free personal responsibility, human dignity, the intelligence, the creativity and imagination, consciousness and so forth. These are the sorts of things that we typically connect to personhood, and to say, well, pantheism is just as likely a source as a personal being, this greatest conceivable being. I'd say no, not at all. There's a nice seamless connection between this personal being and these sorts of features that we take for granted about ourselves, let alone some of these features, about the universe and how it developed and so forth, how it came to being. So I'd say that there is a natural connection between this personal being, God, and the sorts of things that we take for granted about our own human life, our own human existence, the things that we say are part of our own common sense experience, and and the idea that somehow pantheism could have produced all of these things. We don't know how, but it could have produced them. I'd say I think there's evidence for there's this connection is itself evidence for a theistic worldview rather than a naturalistic pantheistic one. Anyway, got to wrap up there, but I
Yeah.
appreciate your taking the time. Feel free to end up with whatever closing remarks you do, but I need to be off here in just a minute.
Yeah, I know you said you got to go. So yeah, I would just say that I believe the ontological argument of the maximally great being is equally arbitrary, and I can make the same argument for the maximally great pantheism. But that would be a conversation for another time.
Okay. All right.
So
Very
thanks,
good.
thanks for
No
coming
problem.
on. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I hope we can talk again sometime. Have a great day.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Tom. Great to be with you. Excellent.
Bye.
All right. Bye.